Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster, was an American serial killer and sex offender who killed and dismembered 17 males between 1978 and 1991. Many of his later murders involved necrophilia, cannibalism, and the permanent preservation of body parts, typically all or part of the skeleton. Although he was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, BPD, schizotypal personality disorder, STPD, and a psychotic disorder, Dahmer was found to be legally sane at his trial. He was convicted of 15 of the 16 homicides he had committed in Wisconsin and was sentenced to 15 terms of life imprisonment on February 17, 1992. Dahmer was later sentenced to a 16th term of life imprisonment for an additional homicide committed in Ohio in 1978. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was beaten to death by Christopher Scarver, a fellow inmate at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He was the first of two sons born to Lionel Herbert Dahmer, a Marquette University chemistry student who later became a research chemist, and Joyce Annette Dahmer, née Flint, who worked as a teletype machine instructor. Lionel had German and Welsh heritage, while Joyce had English, Norwegian, and Irish ancestry. Some reports suggest that Dahmer received little attention as an infant, while others indicate that he was cared for attentively by both parents during his infancy and toddler years. However, his mother, known to seek attention and sympathy, was often tense and argumentative with her husband and neighbors. As Dahmer started first grade, Lionel's academic commitments kept him away from home frequently. Meanwhile, his wife, who was a hypochondriac and struggled with depression, demanded constant attention and spent increasing time in bed. There were instances where she attempted suicide using Equinyl. Consequently, both parents were unable to dedicate significant time to their son. Dahmer later recalled feeling unsure of the solidity of the family from an early age, citing a backdrop of intense tension and frequent arguments between his parents during his formative years. As a young child, Dahmer was described as an energetic and joyful individual, but underwent a significant change in demeanor after undergoing double hernia surgery shortly before turning 4. During his elementary school years, he was known for his quiet and reserved nature. One teacher noted early signs of feelings of abandonment, likely stemming from his father's frequent absence and his mother's illnesses. These feelings intensified when his mother fell pregnant with her second child. Throughout elementary school, Dahmer had only a few close friends. In October 1966, the family relocated to Doylestown, Ohio. Following the birth of his younger brother David in December, Dahmer was given the opportunity to choose the name for the new addition to the family. He chose the name David. That same year, Lionel completed his degree and commenced work as an analytical chemist in nearby Akron, Ohio. From a young age, Dahmer exhibited a peculiar fascination with deceased animals. This intrigue might have originated at the age of 4 when he witnessed his father extracting animal bones from beneath their family home. Lionel recounted Dahmer's fascination with the sound the bones made, and he became captivated by animal bones, which he initially referred to as his fiddlesticks. Dahmer would occasionally search around the family home for more bones and explore live animals to learn about their bone structure. In May 1968, the Dahmer family relocated to Bath Township, Summit County, Ohio, marking their third move in just 2 years and the sixth residence since their marriage. Their new home, situated on 1.5 acres of wooded land, included a small hut a short distance from the main house. It was here that Dahmer began collecting various insects and the skeletons of small animals like chipmunks and squirrels. He preserved some of these remains in formaldehyde-filled jars kept within the hut. 2 years later, during a family dinner featuring chicken, Dahmer, displaying what appeared to be scientific curiosity, asked his father Lionel about the effects of placing chicken bones in bleach. Lionel, encouraged by his son's interest, proceeded to demonstrate the safe bleaching and preservation of animal bones. Dahmer adopted these preservation techniques into his bone collection practices. He expanded his collection to include dead animals, including those from roadkill, which he would dissect and inter alongside the hut. On occasion, he placed the skulls atop makeshift crosses. A friend of Dahmer recalled that Dahmer shared his curiosity about understanding how animals fit together. In a disturbing incident in 1975, Dahmer decapitated a dog's carcass and affixed the body to a tree, impaling the skull on a stick in the wooded area behind his house. He later invited a friend to witness the grotesque display, framing it as a prank and claiming to have stumbled upon the remains by chance. In the same year that Lionel taught his son bone preservation techniques, Joyce escalated her consumption of equinyl, laxatives, and sleeping pills, further distancing herself from her husband and children. From his freshman year at Revere High School, Dahmer was seen as an outcast. By age 14, he had begun drinking beer and hard alcohol in the daylight hours, frequently concealing his liquor inside the jacket he wore to school. Dahmer mentioned to one classmate who inquired why he was drinking scotch in a morning history class that the alcohol he consumed was my medicine. Although largely uncommunicative, in his freshman year Dahmer was seen by staff as polite and highly intelligent but with average grades. He was a competitive tennis player and played briefly in the high school band. When he reached puberty, Dahmer discovered he was gay. He did not tell his parents. In his early teens, he had a brief relationship with another teenage boy, although they never had intercourse. By Dahmer's admission, he began fantasizing about dominating and controlling a completely submissive male partner in his early to mid-teens, and his masturbatory fantasies gradually evolved to his focusing on chests and torsos. These fantasies gradually became intertwined with dissection. When he was about 16, Dahmer conceived a fantasy of rendering unconscious a particular male jogger he found attractive, and then making sexual use of his body. On one occasion, Dahmer concealed himself in bushes with a baseball bat to lie in wait for this man. However, the jogger did not pass by on that particular day. Dahmer later admitted this was his first attempt to attack and render an individual submissive to him. In high school, Dahmer earned a reputation among his peers as a class clown, often orchestrating pranks dubbed as doing a Dahmer. These antics included imitating sounds and simulating seizures or cerebral palsy at school and local stores, sometimes performing them for money to fund his alcohol purchases. By 1977, Dahmer's academic performance took a hit, leading to a decline in his grades. In an attempt to improve his performance, his parents enlisted the help of a private tutor, but the results were limited. That same year, in a last-ditch effort to salvage their marriage, Dahmer's parents attended counseling sessions, but their frequent disagreements persisted. Upon discovering Joyce's brief affair in September 1977, they made the difficult decision to divorce, reassuring their sons that they intended to part ways amicably. However, the divorce process turned acrimonious, and Lionel relocated to a motel on North Cleveland-Massillon Road in early 1978. In May 1978, Dahmer graduated from high school. A few weeks prior to graduation, a teacher spotted Dahmer close to the school parking lot, consuming multiple cans of beer. When confronted, Dahmer mentioned he was facing a lot of problems at home, revealing that the school's guidance counselor was already aware. During that spring, contrary to a court order and without notifying Lionel, Joyce relocated out of the family home with David, moving to live with relatives in Chippewa Falls, Wisconsin. At the time, Dahmer had recently turned 18 and continued residing in the family home. The divorce between Dahmer's parents was finalized on July 24, 1978, with Joyce being granted custody of her younger son and receiving alimony payments. Dahmer carried out his initial murder in 1978, just 3 weeks after graduating from high school. On June 18, he encountered a hitchhiker named Stephen Mark Hicks, who was nearing 19 years old. Dahmer enticed Hicks to come to his residence under the pretense of sharing some drinks. Hicks, who had been hitchhiking to a rock concert at Chippewa Lake Park, Ohio, agreed to accompany Dahmer to his home with the assurance of enjoying a few beers, since Dahmer had the house to himself. According to Dahmer, the sight of the bare-chested Hicks standing at the roadside stirred his sexual feelings, although when Hicks began talking about girls, he knew any sexual passes he made would be rebuffed. After several hours of talking, drinking and listening to music, Hicks wanted to leave and I didn't want him to leave. Dahmer bludgeoned Hicks with a 10-pound, 4.5 kilograms, dumbbell. He later stated he struck Hicks twice from behind with the dumbbell as Hicks sat upon a chair. When Hicks fell unconscious, Dahmer strangled him to death with the bar of the dumbbell, then stripped the clothes from Hicks' body before exploring his chest with his hands, then masturbating as he stood above the corpse. Hours later, Dahmer dragged the body to the basement. The following day, Dahmer dissected Hicks' body in his basement. He later buried the remains in a shallow grave in his backyard. Several weeks later, he unearthed the remains and pared the flesh from the bones. He dissolved the flesh in acid before flushing the solution down the toilet. He crushed the bones with a sledgehammer and scattered them in the woodland behind the family home. Hicks' necklace and the knife used to dismember him were thrown from the West Bath Road Bridge into the Cuyahoga River. 6 weeks after the murder of Hicks, Dahmer's father and his fiancée returned to his home, where they discovered Dahmer living alone. That August, Dahmer enrolled at Ohio State University, OSU, hoping to major in business. Dahmer's sole term at OSU was completely unproductive, largely because of his persistent alcohol abuse. He received failing grades in Introduction to Anthropology, Classical Civilizations, and Administrative Science. The only course Dahmer was successful at was riflery, having received a B- grade. His overall GPA was 0.45, 4.0. On one occasion, Lionel paid a surprise visit to his son, only to find his room strewn with empty liquor bottles. Despite his father having paid in advance for the second term, Dahmer dropped out of OSU after just 3 months. In January 1979, at his father's urging, Dahmer enlisted in the United States Army. He underwent basic training at Fort McClellan in Anniston, Alabama, followed by medical specialist training at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas. During his time at Fort Sam Houston, Dahmer faced occasional reprimands for instances of intoxication. On one occasion, his insubordination led to punishment for his entire platoon, resulting in a severe beating from his fellow recruits. On July 13, 1979, Dahmer was stationed in Baumholder, West Germany, serving as a combat medic with the 2nd Battalion, 68th Armored Regiment, 8th Infantry Division. In the initial year of his service, Dahmer was regarded as an average or slightly above average soldier, according to published reports. Due to his ongoing struggles with alcohol abuse, Dahmer's performance progressively worsened. In March 1981, he was deemed unfit for military service and subsequently received an honorable discharge from the Army. The decision was based on the belief that the issues Dahmer faced during his time in the Army were not indicative of challenges he would encounter in civilian life. On March 24, 1981, Dahmer was relocated to Fort Jackson, South Carolina, for debriefing and received a plane ticket to travel anywhere in the country. Dahmer later conveyed to the police that he couldn't bear the idea of returning home to face his father. Therefore, he chose to journey to Miami Beach, Florida, both because he was tired of the cold and sought to lead an independent life. Upon arriving in Florida, Dahmer secured employment at a delicatessen and rented a room in a nearby motel. However, he soon faced eviction due to non-payment, primarily as a result of spending most of his earnings on alcohol. During this time, he spent evenings on the beach while maintaining his job at the sandwich shop. In September of that year, he contacted his father and requested to return to Ohio. Following his return to Ohio, Dahmer initially resided with his father and stepmother. He busied himself with various chores while searching for employment. Despite this, he continued to struggle with heavy drinking. Just 2 weeks after coming back, he was arrested for drunk and disorderly conduct, resulting in a fine of $60 and a suspended 10-day jail sentence. Dahmer's father made efforts to help him overcome his alcohol addiction but was met with little success. In December 1981, Dahmer's father and stepmother decided to send him to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. Dahmer displayed affection only towards his grandmother, and they hoped that her influence, coupled with the change in location, might encourage him to abandon alcohol, secure a job, and embrace a more responsible lifestyle. At first, Dahmer's living situation with his grandmother was relatively peaceful. He accompanied her to church, willingly took on chores, actively sought employment, and generally followed her household rules, despite maintaining his habits of drinking and smoking. In early 1982, he secured a job as a phlebotomist at the Milwaukee Blood Plasma Center. He held this position for 10 months before facing a layoff. Following this, Dahmer remained unemployed for more than 2 years, relying on financial assistance from his grandmother. Shortly before losing his job, Dahmer faced an arrest for indecent exposure. On August 8, 1982, at Wisconsin State Fair Park, he was apprehended for exposing himself, on the south side of the Coliseum, with 25 people present, including women and children. This incident resulted in a conviction, with Dahmer receiving a fine of $50 in addition to covering court costs. In January 1985, Dahmer secured a position as a mixer at the Milwaukee Ambrosia Chocolate Factory, working the night shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. 6 nights a week, with Saturday evenings off. Shortly after starting this job, an incident unfolded in the West Allis Public Library where Dahmer was propositioned by another man while reading. The stranger discreetly passed Dahmer a note, suggesting performing a sexual act on him, Although Dahmer did not engage with this proposition, the incident triggered the fantasies of control and dominance he had harbored since his teenage years. Subsequently, he began immersing himself in Milwaukee's gay bars, gay bathhouses, and bookstores. Additionally, he pilfered a male mannequin from a store, which he briefly utilized for sexual gratification. However, his grandmother stumbled upon the item in a closet, prompting her to insist that he dispose of it. By the latter part of 1985, Dahmer had established a routine of regularly visiting bathhouses, describing them later as relaxing places. However, during his sexual encounters, he grew frustrated with his partners moving during the act. In hindsight, he revealed, "I trained myself to view people as objects of pleasure instead of as people." Consequently, starting in June 1986, he began administering sleeping pills laced with sedatives to his partners, mixed with alcoholic beverages. After ensuring his partner had fallen asleep, he engaged in various sexual acts. To maintain a steady supply of these sedatives, Dahmer informed doctors that he worked night shifts and needed the tablets to adjust to his schedule. After approximately 12 such instances, the bathhouses revoked Dahmer's membership, prompting him to use hotel rooms to continue this disturbing practice. Shortly after being barred from the bathhouses, Dahmer came across a newspaper report about the upcoming funeral of an 18-year-old male. This triggered the idea of pilfering the recently buried corpse and taking it home with him. Dahmer attempted to excavate the coffin from the ground, but the soil proved too hard, prompting him to abandon the plan. On September 8, 1986, Dahmer was apprehended and charged with lewd and lascivious behavior for engaging in an inappropriate act in the presence of two 12-year-old boys near the Kinnickinnic River. Initially, he claimed he was simply urinating, unaware that there were witnesses. However, he eventually confessed to the offense. The charge was later modified to disorderly conduct. Subsequently, on March 10, 1987, Dahmer received a sentence of 1 year of probation, along with a mandate to attend counseling. On November 20, 1987, while residing with his grandmother in West Allis, Dahmer encountered a 25-year-old man named Stephen Twomey from Ontonagon, Michigan, at a bar. Dahmer convinced Twomey to accompany him to the Ambassador Hotel in Milwaukee, where Dahmer had rented a room for the night. According to Dahmer, his original intention was not to kill Twomey, but to drug him and lie beside him as he explored his body. However, the subsequent morning, Dahmer woke up to discover Twomey beneath him on the bed, his chest visibly injured and discolored with bruises. Blood was seeping from the corner of Twomey's mouth, and Dahmer's fists and one forearm showed extensive bruising. Dahmer claimed to have no recollection of the act of killing Twomey and expressed disbelief that such an event had occurred. Dahmer purchased a large suitcase, in which he transported Twomey's body to his grandmother's residence. 1 week later, he severed the head, arms, and legs, then filleted the bones from the body before cutting the flesh into pieces small enough to handle. Dahmer placed the flesh inside plastic garbage bags. He wrapped the bones inside a sheet and pounded them into splinters with a sledgehammer. The dismemberment process took Dahmer approximately 2 hours. He disposed of all of Twomey's remains, excluding the head, in the trash. For 2 weeks following Twomey's killing, Dahmer retained Twomey's head wrapped in a blanket. After 2 weeks, Dahmer boiled the head in a mixture of Soilax, an alkali-based industrial detergent, and bleach in an effort to retain the skull, which he then used as stimulus for masturbation. Eventually, the skull became too brittle by this bleaching process, so Dahmer pulverized and disposed of it. According to Dahmer, Twomey's murder was a pivotal incident after which he did not try to control his compulsions. He began to actively seek victims, most of whom he encountered in or around gay bars, and would typically lure them to his grandmother's home. He would drug his victim with triazolam or temazepam before or shortly after engaging in sexual activity with them. Once his victim was unconscious, he strangled them to death. 2 months after the Twomey killing, Dahmer encountered a 14-year-old Native American prostitute, James Dockstader. Dahmer lured him to his grandmother's residence with an offer of $50 to pose for nude pictures. They engaged in sexual activity before Dahmer drugged Dockstader and strangled him on the floor of the cellar. Dahmer left the body in the cellar for 1 week before dismembering it in much the same manner as he had with Twomey. He placed all of Dockstader's remains, excluding the skull, in the trash. The skull was boiled and cleansed in bleach before Dahmer found that it, too, had been rendered brittle by the process. He pulverized the skull 2 weeks later. On March 24, 1988, Dahmer met a 22-year-old bisexual man, Richard Guerrero, outside a gay bar called the Phoenix. Dahmer lured Guerrero to his grandmother's residence, offering him $50 to spend the night with him. He drugged Guerrero with sleeping pills, strangled him with a leather strap, and filleted the corpse. Dahmer dismembered Guerrero's body within 24 hours, again disposing of the remains in the trash and retaining the skull before pulverizing it several months later. On April 23, Dahmer lured Ronald Flowers Jr. to his house. However, after giving Flowers a drugged coffee, both he and Flowers heard Dahmer's grandmother call, "Is that you, Jeff?" Although Dahmer replied in a manner that led his grandmother to believe he was alone, she observed that he was not alone. Because of this, Dahmer was unable to kill Flowers, instead waiting until he had become unconscious before taking him to the County General Hospital. In September 1988, Dahmer's grandmother requested that he vacate her residence, primarily due to his alcohol consumption, the late-night visits of young men, and the unpleasant odors coming from the basement and garage. Dahmer secured a one-bedroom apartment at 808 North 24th Street and completed his move on September 25. Just 2 days later, he was apprehended for administering drugs and engaging in inappropriate sexual contact with a 13-year-old boy. Dahmer had enticed the boy to his home by falsely claiming he could pose for nude photographs. Dahmer's father enlisted the services of attorney Gerald Boyle to represent his son. As per Boyle's request, Dahmer underwent a series of psychological assessments before his court hearings. The evaluations indicated that Dahmer grappled with profound feelings of estrangement. A subsequent evaluation 2 months later identified Dahmer as an impulsive individual, suspicious of others, and disillusioned by his perceived lack of achievements in life. His probation officer also cited a 1987 diagnosis of Dahmer with a schizoid personality disorder for court reference. On January 30, 1989, Dahmer entered a guilty plea for the charges of second-degree sexual assault and enticing a child for immoral purposes. The sentencing was deferred until May. On March 20, during a 10-day Easter break from work, Dahmer relocated to his grandmother's residence. 2 months after his conviction and 2 months prior to his sentencing, Dahmer murdered his fifth victim, a 24-year-old mixed-race aspiring model, Anthony Sears, whom he met at a gay bar on March 25, 1989. According to Dahmer, on this particular occasion he was not looking to commit a crime. However, shortly before closing time that evening, Sears just started talking to me. Dahmer lured Sears to his grandmother's home, where the pair engaged in oral sex before Dahmer drugged and strangled Sears. The following morning, Dahmer placed the corpse in his grandmother's bathtub, where he decapitated the body before attempting to flay the corpse. He stripped the flesh from the body and pulverized the bones, which he disposed of in the trash. According to Dahmer, he found Sears exceptionally attractive, and Sears was the first victim from whom he permanently retained any body parts. He preserved Sears' head and genitalia in acetone and stored them in a wooden box, which he later placed in his work locker. When he moved to a new address the following year, he took the remains there. On May 23, 1989, Dahmer received a sentence of 5 years probation and 1 year at the House of Correction, with the allowance of work release to retain his job. Additionally, he was mandated to register as a sex offender. However, 2 months before his expected release, Dahmer was granted parole from this arrangement. This marked the commencement of his 5-year probation from 1989. Dahmer subsequently temporarily relocated to his grandmother's residence in West Allis. On May 14, 1990, Dahmer moved out of his grandmother's house and into 924 North 25th Street, apartment 213, taking Sears' mummified head and genitals with him. Although located in a high-crime area, Dahmer's new apartment was close to his workplace, was furnished, and at $300 per month inclusive of all bills excluding electricity, was economical. Within 1 week of his moving to this address, Dahmer killed his sixth victim, Raymond Smith. Smith was a 32-year-old prostitute whom Dahmer lured to his apartment with the promise of $50 for sex. Inside the apartment, he gave Smith a drink laced with 7 sleeping pills, then manually strangled him. The following day, Dahmer purchased a Polaroid camera, with which he took several pictures of Smith's body in suggestive positions before dismembering him in the bathroom. He boiled the legs, arms, and pelvis in a steel kettle with Soilax, which allowed him to rinse the bones in his sink. Dahmer dissolved the remainder of Smith's skeleton, excluding the skull, in a container filled with acid. He later spray-painted Smith's skull, which he placed alongside the skull of Sears upon a black towel inside a filing cabinet. Approximately 1 week after the murder of Smith, on or about May 27, Dahmer lured another young man to his apartment. On this occasion, Dahmer accidentally consumed the drink laden with sedatives intended for his guest. When he awoke the following day, he discovered the man had stolen several items of clothing, $300 and a watch. Dahmer never reported this incident to the police, although on May 29, he divulged to his probation officer that he had been robbed. In June 1990, Dahmer lured a 27-year-old acquaintance, Edward Smith, to his apartment, where he drugged and strangled him. On this occasion, rather than immediately acidifying the skeleton or repeating previous processes of bleaching, which had rendered previous victims' skulls brittle, Dahmer placed Smith's skeleton in his freezer for several months in the hope it would not retain moisture. Freezing the skeleton did not remove moisture, and the skeleton of this victim was acidified several months later. Dahmer accidentally destroyed the skull when he placed it in the oven to dry, a process that caused the skull to explode. Dahmer later informed police he had felt rotten about Smith's murder, as he had been unable to retain any parts of his body. Less than 3 months after the murder of Edward Smith, Dahmer encountered a 22-year-old Chicago native named Ernest Miller outside a bookstore on the corner of North 27th Street. Miller agreed to accompany Dahmer to his apartment for $50 and further agreed to allow him to listen to his heart and stomach. When Dahmer attempted to perform oral sex upon Miller, he was informed, "That'll cost you extra," whereupon Dahmer gave Miller a drink laced with 2 sleeping pills. On this occasion, Dahmer had only 2 sleeping pills to give his victim. Therefore, he killed Miller by slashing his carotid artery with the same knife he used to dissect his victims' bodies. Miller bled to death within minutes. Dahmer then posed the nude body for various suggestive Polaroid photographs before placing it in his bathtub for dismemberment. Dahmer repeatedly kissed and talked to the severed head while he dismembered the remainder of the body. Dahmer wrapped Miller's heart, liver, biceps, and portions of flesh from the legs in plastic bags and placed them in the freezer for later consumption. He boiled the remaining flesh and organs into a jelly-like substance, using soilax, which enabled him to rinse the flesh off the skeleton, which he intended to retain. To preserve the skeleton, Dahmer placed the bones in a light bleach solution for 24 hours before allowing them to dry upon a cloth for 1 week. The severed head was initially placed in the refrigerator before being stripped of flesh, then painted and coated with enamel. 3 weeks after the murder of Miller, on September 24, Dahmer encountered a 22-year-old father of 2 named David Thomas at the Grand Avenue Mall. He persuaded him to return to his apartment for a few drinks, with additional money on offer if he would pose for photographs. In his statement to police after his arrest, Dahmer said that, after giving Thomas a drink laden with sedatives, he did not feel attracted to him, but was afraid to allow him to awaken, fearing that he would be angry over having been drugged. Therefore, he strangled him and dismembered the body, intentionally retaining no body parts whatsoever. He photographed the dismemberment process and retained these photographs, which later aided in Thomas's identification. After the murder of Thomas, Dahmer refrained from taking another life for nearly 5 months. However, between October 1990 and February 1991, on at least 5 occasions, he made unsuccessful attempts to entice men to his apartment. Throughout 1990, Dahmer frequently expressed feelings of anxiety and depression to his probation officer, often mentioning concerns about his sexuality, isolated lifestyle, financial struggles, and, particularly before Thanksgiving, his unease about encountering his father and younger brother. Additionally, Dahmer openly disclosed having thoughts of suicide on several occasions. In February 1991, Dahmer observed a 17-year-old named Curtis Straughter standing at a bus stop near Marquette University. According to Dahmer, he lured Straughter into his apartment with an offer of money for posing for nude photos, with the added incentive of sexual intercourse. Dahmer drugged Straughter, cuffed his hands behind his back, then strangled him to death with a leather strap. He then dismembered Straughter, retaining his skull, hands, and genitals and photographing each stage of the dismemberment process. Less than 2 months later, on April 7, Dahmer encountered a 19-year-old named Errol Lindsay walking to get a key cut. Dahmer lured Lindsay to his apartment where he drugged him, then drilled a hole in his skull through which he injected hydrochloric acid with a baster. According to Dahmer, Lindsay awoke after this experiment, which Dahmer had conceived in the hope of inducing a permanent, unresistant, submissive state, saying, "I have a headache. What time is it?" In response to this, Dahmer again drugged Lindsay, then strangled him. He decapitated Lindsay and retained his skull. He then flayed Lindsay's body, placing the skin in a solution of cold water and salt for several weeks in the hope of permanently retaining it. Reluctantly, he disposed of Lindsay's skin when he noted it had become too frayed and brittle. By 1991, occupants of the Oxford apartments had registered repeated grievances with the building's manager, Sopa Princewell, concerning the unpleasant odors and occasional sounds emerging from apartment 213. These sounds included falling objects and, at times, the noise of a chainsaw. Princewell reached out to Dahmer regarding these complaints on multiple occasions. Initially, Dahmer attributed the noxious odors from his apartment to a malfunctioning freezer that had caused the contents to spoil. However, in subsequent interactions, he informed Princewell that the re-emergence of the odor was due to several of his tropical fish recently perishing and assured that he would address the issue. On May 24, 1991, Dahmer encountered 31-year-old aspiring model Tony Hughes at a nightclub. He was lured to Dahmer's apartment with an offer of money to pose for photographs. Hughes was drugged into unconsciousness before Dahmer injected hydrochloric acid into his skull in an effort to disable his will and render him submissive, although on this occasion, the drilling and injection proved fatal. On the afternoon of May 26, 1991, Dahmer encountered a 14-year-old Lao teenager, Canaric Synthesymphone, on Wisconsin Avenue. Unknown to Dahmer, Synthesymphone was the younger brother of the boy he had molested in 1988. Dahmer offered Synthesymphone money to accompany him to his apartment to pose for Polaroid pictures. According to Dahmer, Synthesymphone was initially reluctant to the proposal, before changing his mind and accompanying him to his apartment, where he posed for 2 pictures in his underwear before Dahmer drugged him into unconsciousness and performed oral sex on him. Before Synthesymphone fell unconscious, Dahmer led the boy into his bedroom, where the body of Tony Hughes, whom Dahmer had killed 3 days earlier, lay naked on the floor. According to Dahmer, he believed that Synthesymphone saw this body, yet did not react to seeing the bloated corpse, likely because of the effects of the sleeping pills he had ingested. On this occasion, Dahmer drilled a single narrow hole into the crown of Synthesymfone's skull, through which he injected hydrochloric acid into the frontal lobe. Dahmer then drank several beers while lying alongside Synthesymphone before briefly falling asleep, then leaving his apartment to drink at a bar and purchase more alcohol. During the early hours of May 27, Dahmer approached his apartment and encountered Synthesymphone sitting unclothed on the corner of 25th and State, engaged in conversation in Lao with 3 distressed young women nearby. Dahmer approached the women and claimed that Synthesymphone, whom he referred to as John Mung, was his friend, attempting to guide him to his apartment by the arm. The 3 women, however, had already called 911 and dissuaded Dahmer. When 2 Milwaukee police officers, John Balcerzik and Joseph Gabrish, arrived at the scene, Dahmer appeared calm. He explained to the officers that Synthesymphone was his 19-year-old boyfriend who had consumed too much alcohol after an argument, frequently displaying such behavior when intoxicated. Dahmer mentioned that his partner had been drinking Jack Daniel's whiskey that evening. The women were frustrated, and one of them tried to convey to the officers, although they had observed only a scrape on Synthesymphone's knee and believed him to be inebriated, that Synthesymphone had blood on his genitals, was bleeding from his rectum, and seemed to have resisted Dahmer's attempts to take him to the apartment before the officers arrived. In response, one of the officers sharply instructed her to mind her own business, told her to shut up, and warned her not to interfere. Following the arrival of the Milwaukee police officers, 3 members of the Milwaukee Fire Department reached the scene. They assessed Synthesymphone for injuries and provided a yellow blanket for the police officers to cover him. One of the firefighters believed Synthesymphone needed medical attention, but the police officers instructed the fire department personnel to leave. Shortly after, Officer Richard Porubkan arrived at the scene. He, along with Gabrish and Balcerzik, escorted Dahmer and Synthesymphone to Dahmer's apartment. During this time, Dahmer made repeated comments about the general crime in the neighborhood and expressed gratitude towards the police. Inside the apartment, and to substantiate his claim that he and Synthesymphone were lovers, Dahmer showed the officers 2 semi-nude Polaroid pictures he had taken of Synthesymphone the previous evening. Balcerzik mentioned he detected no unusual odors, but Gabrish later stated he noticed a peculiar scent reminiscent of excrement inside the apartment. This odor emanated from the decomposing body of Hughes. Dahmer mentioned this, but one officer merely peeked his head around the bedroom, but really didn't take a good look to investigate. The officers then left, advising Dahmer to take good care of Synthesymphone. This incident was documented by the officers as a domestic dispute. Upon the departure of the 3 officers from his apartment, Dahmer again injected hydrochloric acid into Synthesymphone's brain. This second injection proved fatal. The following day, May 28, Dahmer took a day's leave from work to devote himself to the dismemberment of the bodies of Synthesymphone and Hughes. He retained both victims' skulls. On June 30, Dahmer traveled to Chicago, where he encountered a 20-year-old named Matt Turner at a bus station. Turner accepted Dahmer's offer to travel to Milwaukee for a professional photo shoot. At the apartment, Dahmer drugged, strangled and dismembered Turner and placed his head and internal organs in separate plastic bags in the freezer. Turner was not reported missing. 5 days later, on July 5, Dahmer lured 23-year-old Jeremiah Weinberger from a Chicago bar to his apartment on the promise of spending the weekend with him. He drugged Weinberger and twice injected boiling water through his skull, sending him into a coma from which he died 2 days later. On July 15, Dahmer encountered 24-year-old Oliver Lacey at the corner of 27th and Kilbourne. Lacey agreed to Dahmer's ruse of posing nude for photographs and accompanied him to his apartment, where the pair engaged in tentative sexual activity before Dahmer drugged Lacey. On this occasion, Dahmer intended to prolong the time he spent with Lacey while alive. After unsuccessfully attempting to render Lacey unconscious with chloroform, he phoned his workplace to request a day's absence. This was granted, although the next day, he was suspended. After strangling Lacey, Dahmer had sex with the corpse before dismembering him. He placed Lacey's head and heart in the refrigerator and his skeleton in the freezer. 4 days later, on July 19, Dahmer received word that he was dismissed. Upon receipt of this news, Dahmer lured 25-year-old Joseph Bradahoft to his apartment. Bradahoft was strangled and left lying on Dahmer's bed covered with a sheet for 2 days. On July 21, Dahmer removed the sheet to find the head covered in maggots. He decapitated the body, cleaned the head and placed it in the refrigerator. He later acidified Bradahoft's torso, along with those of 2 other victims killed within the previous month. On July 22, 1991, Dahmer approached 3 men with an offer of $100 to accompany him to his apartment to pose for nude photographs, drink beer and simply keep him company. One of the trio, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards, agreed to accompany him to his apartment. Upon entering Dahmer's apartment, Edwards noted a foul odor and several boxes of hydrochloric acid on the floor, which Dahmer claimed to use for cleaning bricks. After some minor conversation, Edwards responded to Dahmer's request to turn his head and view his tropical fish, whereupon Dahmer placed a handcuff upon his wrist. When Edwards asks, "What's happening?" Dahmer unsuccessfully attempted to cuff his wrists together, then told Edwards to accompany him to the bedroom to pose for nude pictures. While inside the bedroom, Edwards noted nude male posters on the wall and that a videotape of The Exorcist III was playing. He also noted a blue 57-gallon drum in the corner, from which a strong odor emanated. Dahmer then brandished a knife and informed Edwards he intended to take nude pictures of him. In an attempt to appease Dahmer, Edwards unbuttoned his shirt, saying he would allow him to do so if he would remove the handcuffs and put the knife away. In response to this promise, Dahmer simply turned his attention towards the TV. Edwards observed Dahmer rocking back and forth and chanting before turning his attention back to him. He placed his head on Edwards' chest, listened to his heartbeat and, with the knife pressed against his intended victim, informed Edwards he intended to eat his heart. In persistent efforts to thwart Dahmer from assaulting him, Edwards reiterated that they were friends and that he had no intention of fleeing. Edwards had made up his mind to either leap from a window or bolt through the unlocked front door at the earliest opportunity. The next time Edwards mentioned needing to use the bathroom, he suggested they sit in the living room with a beer, where it was cooler. Dahmer agreed, and they proceeded to the living room after Edwards came out of the bathroom. While in the living room, Edwards waited until he noticed Dahmer momentarily distracted before requesting another visit to the bathroom. As Edwards got up from the couch, he noticed Dahmer was no longer holding the handcuffs. Swiftly, Edwards struck Dahmer in the face, throwing him off balance, and sprinted out of the front door. At 11:30 p.m. on July 22, Edwards hailed 2 Milwaukee police officers, Robert Routh and Rolf Muller, at the corner of North 25th Street. The officers noticed Edwards had a handcuff attached to his wrist, prompting him to explain that a strange individual had restrained him with the handcuffs and requested assistance to remove them. When the officers' handcuff keys proved incompatible with the brand of handcuffs, Edwards agreed to accompany them to the apartment where he had spent the previous 5 hours before managing to escape. Upon reaching apartment 213, Dahmer welcomed the trio inside and admitted to placing the handcuffs on Edwards, providing no explanation for his actions. At this point, Edwards revealed to the officers that Dahmer had also threatened him with a large knife, an incident that occurred in the bedroom. Dahmer remained silent regarding this revelation and informed one of the officers, Muller, that the key to the handcuffs could be found in his bedside dresser. Muller proceeded to enter the bedroom, prompting Dahmer to attempt to intervene and retrieve the key himself. However, the other officer present, Ralph, instructed him to back off. In the bedroom, Muller observed a substantial knife underneath the bed. As he continued his examination, he discovered an open drawer filled with numerous Polaroid photographs, many depicting human bodies at different stages of dismemberment. The decor and surroundings in these pictures matched the apartment they were currently in. Muller proceeded to the living room to display the photographs to his partner, emphasizing, "These are authentic." When Dahmer saw that Muller was holding several of his Polaroids, he fought with the officers in an effort to resist arrest. The officers quickly overpowered him, cuffed his hands behind his back, and called a second squad car for backup. At this point, Muller opened the refrigerator to reveal the freshly severed head of a black male on the bottom shelf. As Dahmer lay pinned on the floor beneath Ralph, he turned his head towards the officers and muttered the words, "For what I did I should be dead." A more detailed search of the apartment, conducted by the Milwaukee Police's Criminal Investigation Bureau, revealed a total of 4 severed heads in Dahmer's kitchen. A total of 7 skulls, some painted, some bleached, were found in Dahmer's bedroom and inside a closet. Investigators discovered collected blood drippings upon a tray at the bottom of Dahmer's refrigerator, plus 2 human hearts and a portion of arm muscle, each wrapped inside plastic bags upon the shelves. In Dahmer's freezer, investigators discovered an entire torso, plus a bag of human organs and flesh stuck to the ice at the bottom. Elsewhere in apartment 213, investigators discovered 2 entire skeletons, a pair of severed hands, 2 severed and preserved penises, a mummified scalp and, in the 57-gallon drum, 3 further dismembered torsos dissolving in the acid solution. A total of 74 Polaroid pictures detailing the dismemberment of Dahmer's victims were found. In reference to the recovery of body parts and artifacts at 924 North 25th Street, the chief medical examiner later stated, "It was more like dismantling someone's museum than an actual crime scene." Starting in the early hours of July 23, 1991, Detective Patrick Kennedy initiated the questioning of Dahmer regarding the murders he had committed and the evidence found at his apartment. Over the subsequent 2 weeks, Detective Kennedy and later Detective Dennis Murphy conducted a series of extensive interviews with Dahmer, amounting to over 60 hours of dialogue. Dahmer voluntarily waived his right to have an attorney present during these interrogations, expressing his desire to fully confess, acknowledging that he had created this horror, and felt compelled to end it. He openly confessed to the murders of 16 young men in Wisconsin since 1987, with an additional victim, Stephen Hicks, killed in Ohio in 1978. Most of Dahmer's victims had been rendered unconscious prior to their murder, although some had died as a result of having acid or boiling water injected into their brain. As he had no memory of the killing of his second victim, Stephen Twomey, he was unsure whether he was unconscious when beaten to death, although he did concede it was possible that his viewing the exposed chest of Twomey while in a drunken stupor may have led him to unsuccessfully attempt to tear Twomey's heart from his chest. Almost all the murders Dahmer committed after moving into the Oxford apartments had involved a ritual of posing the victims' bodies in suggestive positions, typically with the chest thrust outwards, prior to dismemberment. Dahmer readily admitted to engaging in necrophilia with several of his victims' bodies, including performing sexual acts with their viscera as he dismembered their bodies in his bathtub. Having noted that much of the blood pooled inside his victim's chest after death, Dahmer first removed their internal organs, then suspended the torso so the blood drained into his bathtub, before dicing any organs he did not wish to retain and paring the flesh from the body. The bones he wished to dispose of were pulverized or acidified, with soilax and bleach solutions used to aid in the preservation of the skeletons and skulls he wished to keep. Dahmer confessed to having consumed the hearts, liver, biceps, and portions of thigh of 3 victims he had killed at the Oxford apartments, Raymond Smith, Ernest Miller and Oliver Lacey, and to have retained the flesh and organs of other victims for intended consumption. Typically, Dahmer would tenderize the body parts he intended to consume prior to preparing meals flavored with various condiments. Referencing his reasons for consuming his victims, Dahmer stated he had initially consumed portions of his victims due to curiosity, before adding, "I suppose, in an odd way, it made me feel they were even more a permanent part of me." Describing the increase in his rate of killing in the 2 months prior to his arrest, Dahmer stated he had been completely swept along with his compulsion to kill, adding, "It was an incessant and never-ending desire to be with someone at whatever cost. Someone good-looking, really nice-looking. It just filled my thoughts all day long." When asked as to why he had preserved a total of 7 skulls and the entire skeletons of 2 victims, Dahmer stated he had been in the process of constructing a private altar of victims' skulls which he had intended to display on the black table located in his living room and upon which he had photographed the bodies of many of his victims. This display of skulls was to be adorned at each side with the complete skeletons of Miller and Lacey. The 4 severed heads found in his kitchen were to have all flesh removed and used in this altar, as was the skull of at least one future victim. Incense sticks were to be placed at each end of the black table, above which Dahmer intended to place a large blue lamp with extending blue globe lights. The entire construction was to be placed before a window covered with a black, opaque shower curtain, in front of which Dahmer intended to sit in a black leather chair. When asked in a November 18, 1991 interview to whom the altar was dedicated, Dahmer replied, "Myself. It was a place where I could feel at home." He further described his intended altar as a place for meditation, from where he believed he could draw a sense of power, adding, "If this, his arrest, had happened 6 months later, that's what they would have found." On July 25, 1991, Dahmer faced charges for 4 counts of first-degree murder. By August 22, he faced an additional 11 murder charges in Wisconsin. On September 14, investigators in Ohio discovered bone fragments in the woodland behind Dahmer's confessed first victim's location. They officially identified Hicks using dental records and charged Dahmer with his murder on September 17. Dahmer was not charged for the attempted murder of Edwards or the murder of Twomey. The Milwaukee County District Attorney only pursued charges where murder could be definitively proven beyond a reasonable doubt. As Dahmer had no recollection of Twomey's murder and lacked physical evidence for that particular crime, he was not charged with it. During a preliminary hearing on January 13, 1992, Dahmer entered a plea of guilty but insane for 15 counts of murder. Dahmer's trial commenced on January 30, 1992, held in Milwaukee for the 15 counts of first-degree murder under Judge Lawrence Graham. Dahmer's guilty plea on January 13 had relinquished his right to a trial aimed at establishing guilt, as outlined by Wisconsin law. The trial involved a legal discussion regarding whether Dahmer suffered from a mental or personality disorder. The prosecution contended that any disorders Dahmer had did not negate his capacity to comprehend the criminal nature of his actions or resist his impulses. Conversely, the defense argued that Dahmer grappled with a mental illness, driven by obsessions and impulses beyond his control. Defense experts posited that Dahmer's insanity stemmed from his necrophilic impulses, his relentless urge to engage in sexual activities with corpses. Fred Berlin, an expert presented by the defense, testified that Dahmer's actions were beyond his control due to his paraphilia, particularly necrophilia. Another expert, Judith Becker, a professor specializing in psychiatry and psychology, diagnosed Dahmer as a necrophiliac, adding that Dahmer mentioned a preference for comatose sexual partners over deceased ones about 75% of the time. The final defense expert, forensic psychiatrist Carl Wallstrom, diagnosed Dahmer with necrophilia, borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, alcohol dependence, and a psychotic disorder. On February 8, Fred Fosdal testified as a prosecution witness. He asserted his belief that Dahmer did not suffer from any mental disease or defect at the time he carried out the murders. Fosdal characterized Dahmer as a calculating and astute individual who could distinguish between right and wrong, exercising control over his actions even though his lust overpowered his morals. While Fosdal acknowledged Dahmer's paraphilic tendencies, he did not believe Dahmer was a sadist. The final prosecution witness, forensic psychiatrist Park Dietz, began his testimony on February 12. Dietz stated that he found no indication of mental illness or defect in Dahmer at the time of the murders. He emphasized that Dahmer meticulously planned each murder, demonstrating an ability to be alone with the victims and avoid witnesses. Dietz highlighted Dahmer's premeditation, asserting that his crimes were not impulsive. Although Dietz acknowledged that acquiring a paraphilia was not a matter of personal choice, he pointed out that Dahmer's practice of getting intoxicated before each murder was significant. Dietz argued that if Dahmer had an impulse or compulsion to kill, he wouldn't need to consume alcohol to act on it, indicating that Dahmer drank to overcome inhibitions against killing. Dietz highlighted Dahmer's strong identification with the antagonists in The Exorcist III and Return of the Jedi, particularly their levels of power. He elaborated on the impact of these movies on Dahmer's psyche and the link to several murders at the Oxford apartments. Dietz revealed that Dahmer would sometimes watch scenes from these films before seeking out a victim. He provided diagnoses of substance use disorder, paraphilia, and schizotypal personality disorder for Dahmer. Court-appointed mental health professionals, forensic psychiatrist George Palermo and clinical psychologist Samuel Friedman, provided independent testimony. Palermo expressed that the murders stemmed from pent-up aggression within himself, driven by Dahmer's desire to eliminate the source of his homosexual attraction to the victims. He diagnosed Dahmer with a severe mixed personality disorder, encompassing antisocial, obsessive-compulsive, sadistic, fetishistic, borderline, and necrophilic features, while asserting that Dahmer was legally sane. Friedman asserted that Dahmer's longing for companionship drove him to commit the killings and clarified that Dahmer was not psychotic. He portrayed Dahmer as affable, pleasant, courteous, with a good sense of humor, conventionally handsome, and charming in manner. Friedman diagnosed Dahmer with a personality disorder not otherwise specified, involving borderline, obsessive-compulsive, and sadistic traits. The trial extended over a 2-week period. On February 14, both attorneys presented their closing arguments to the jury, each allotted a 2-hour timeslot. Defense attorney Gerald Boyle commenced the arguments. He extensively referenced the testimonies of mental health professionals, who overwhelmingly agreed that Dahmer suffered from a mental disorder. Boyle contended that Dahmer's compulsive killings were a result of a sickness he had discovered, not chosen. He portrayed Dahmer as a desperately lonely and profoundly sick individual who had lost control over his actions. Following a 75-minute closing argument from the defense counsel, Michael McCann, representing the prosecution, delivered his closing statement. He depicted Dahmer as a sane man fully in control of his actions, who strategically sought to evade detection. McCann characterized Dahmer as a calculated individual who killed to exert control over his victims and maintain their bodies to extend his period of sexual pleasure. McCann argued that Dahmer's plea of guilty but insane was an attempt to escape accountability for his heinous crimes. On February 15, the court reconvened to announce the verdict. Dahmer was declared sane and not suffering from a mental disorder at the time of each of the 15 murders he was tried for. However, 2 of the 12 jurors dissented on each count. The formal sentencing was scheduled for February 17. On this date, Dahmer's attorney stated that Dahmer wished to address the court. Dahmer approached a lectern and read from a prepared statement, facing the judge. Dahmer was sentenced to life imprisonment plus 10 years for the first 2 counts. The remaining 13 counts carried a mandatory sentence of life imprisonment plus 70 years. Judge Graham did not have the option of considering the death penalty during the penalty phase, as Wisconsin had abolished capital punishment in 1853. Upon learning of Dahmer's sentencing, his father Lionel and stepmother Sherry requested a 10-minute private meeting with their son before he was transferred to the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage to start his sentence. This request was approved, and they shared hugs and well wishes before Dahmer was escorted away. 3 months after his conviction in Milwaukee, Dahmer was extradited to Ohio to face trial for the murder of his first victim, Stephen Hicks. In a brief court hearing lasting just 45 minutes, Dahmer again pleaded guilty to the charges and received a 16th term of life imprisonment on May 1, 1992. After his sentencing, Dahmer was moved to the Columbia Correctional Institution. During the initial year of his incarceration, he was kept in solitary confinement due to concerns about his safety if placed among other inmates. Dahmer received a significant amount of correspondence from people worldwide, some of whom donated money. He used these funds to acquire items such as cassette recordings, stationery, cigarettes, and magazines. At Dahmer's request, after spending a year in solitary, he was relocated to a less secure unit where he was assigned a daily 2-hour work detail cleaning the toilet block, later expanded to include the prison gymnasium. Shortly after his extensive confessions in 1991, Dahmer asked Detective Murphy for a copy of the Bible, a request that was granted. He gradually turned to Christianity and underwent a spiritual transformation, becoming a born-again Christian. Urged by his father, he also delved into creationist literature from the Institute for Creation Research. In May 1994, Dahmer was baptized by Roy Ratcliffe, a Church of Christ minister and an Oklahoma Christian University graduate whom he had met on April 20. The baptism took place in the prison whirlpool. Following his baptism, Ratcliffe visited Dahmer weekly. They often discussed the concept of death, with Ratcliffe revealing later that, in the months leading up to his death, Dahmer had questioned if he was sinning against God by continuing to live. In a 1994 interview with Stone Phillips on Dateline NBC, Dahmer addressed his crimes, stating, "If a person doesn't think that there is a God to be accountable to, then what's the point of trying to modify your behavior to keep it within acceptable ranges? That's how I thought anyway." On July 3, 1994, a fellow inmate named Osvaldo Durruti made an attempt on Dahmer's life by trying to slash his throat using a razor embedded in a toothbrush, shortly after the conclusion of the weekly prison chapel service. Dahmer sustained minor injuries and was not severely harmed in the attack. Dahmer's family mentioned that he had been prepared for the possibility of death and was willing to accept any consequences he faced in prison. Despite the incident, Dahmer stayed in touch with his father and stepmother regularly. Additionally, his mother, Joyce, maintained consistent communication with him. Before his arrest, Dahmer and his mother had not seen each other since Christmas 1983. During their weekly phone conversations, whenever Joyce expressed concerns about his safety, Dahmer would respond with remarks indicating his indifference. "It doesn't matter, Mom. I don't care if something happens to me." On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer left his cell to conduct his assigned work detail. Accompanying him were two fellow inmates, Jesse Anderson and Christopher Scarver. The trio were left unsupervised in the showers of the prison gym for approximately 20 minutes. At approximately 8:10 a.m., Dahmer was discovered on the floor of the bathrooms of the gym suffering from extreme head wounds. He had been severely bludgeoned about the head and face with a 20-inch, 51-centimeter, metal bar. His head had also been repeatedly struck against the wall in the assault. Although Dahmer was still alive and was rushed to a nearby hospital, he was pronounced dead 1 hour later. Anderson had been beaten with the same instrument. He died from his wounds 2 days later. Scarver, serving a life sentence for a 1990 murder, informed authorities that he initially attacked Dahmer with a metal bar while Dahmer was cleaning a staff locker room. He then attacked Anderson while Anderson was cleaning an inmate locker room. Scarver mentioned that Dahmer did not make any noise during the attack. Right after the assaults, Scarver, who was believed to be schizophrenic, went back to his cell and informed a prison guard, "God told me to do it." Jesse Anderson and Jeffrey Dahmer are dead. Scarver claimed he had not premeditated the attacks, but later admitted to investigators that he had concealed the 20-inch iron bar used to kill both men in his clothing shortly before the killings. Upon hearing of Dahmer's death, his mother Joyce reacted angrily to the media. "Now is everybody happy? Now that he's bludgeoned to death, is that good enough for everyone?" The response from the families of Dahmer's victims varied. Some celebrated the news, while others were saddened. Catherine Lacey, the mother of victim Oliver Lacey, remarked, "The hurt is worse now, because he's not suffering like we are." The district attorney who prosecuted Dahmer cautioned against turning Scarver into a folk hero, emphasizing that Dahmer's death was still murder. On May 15, 1995, Scarver was sentenced to 2 additional terms of life imprisonment for the murders of Dahmer and Anderson. In his will, Dahmer specified that he did not want any services and wished to be cremated. In September 1995, Dahmer's body was cremated, and his ashes were divided between his parents. Due to a disagreement between his parents about whether Dahmer's brain should be preserved for medical research, this organ was initially retained but was later cremated in December 1995. On August 5, 1991, as the extent of Dahmer's crimes came to light, a candlelight vigil aimed at fostering healing and unity in the Milwaukee community was attended by over 400 people. The vigil saw the participation of community leaders, advocates for gay rights, and family members of some of Dahmer's victims. The organizers stated that the purpose of the vigil was to provide a space for Milwaukeeans to express their feelings of pain and anger over what transpired. Dahmer's killings occurred during a period of heightened racial tension in Milwaukee. Walter Farrell, a professor of community studies at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, noted that race relations in the city were already strained for almost a decade leading up to Dahmer's arrest. In an August 1991 interview with the Christian Science Monitor, Farrell emphasized that the news of the murders and the conduct of Milwaukee police officers John Balcerzik and Joseph Gabrish concerning victim Canaric Synthasymphone exacerbated and underscored racial tensions within the city. At the time of Dahmer's murders, Milwaukee's gay scene was predominantly underground and transient, with many sexually active gay men using aliases. The revelations about Dahmer's crimes heightened fear and mistrust within the city's gay community, prompting individuals to be cautious about the intentions of others. However, this fear and distrust waned over time as the 1990s progressed, and the usage of aliases became less common among members of Milwaukee's gay community. The Oxford Apartments, located at 924 North 25th Street, infamous as the site where Dahmer committed 12 of his heinous murders, were demolished in November 1992. The space is now an empty lot. Despite various proposals to transform it into a memorial garden, a playground, or new housing, none of these ideas came to fruition. Dahmer's estate was awarded to the families of 11 victims who had filed damages claims. In 1996, attorney Thomas Jacobson, representing 8 families, announced an auction of Dahmer's estate. While the families clarified that their intent was not driven by greed, the announcement stirred controversy. Milwaukee Civic Pride, a community group, was swiftly formed to gather funds for purchasing and destroying many of Dahmer's belongings. The group pledged $407,225, including a $100,000 donation from Milwaukee real estate developer Joseph Zilber, to acquire Dahmer's estate. 5 of the 8 families represented by Jacobson agreed to the terms, leading to the destruction and burial of Dahmer's possessions in an undisclosed Illinois landfill. Lionel Dahmer, now retired, resided with his second wife, Sherry, until her passing in 2023. They chose not to alter their surname and openly expressed their love for Dahmer despite his heinous acts. In 1994, Lionel penned a book titled, A Father's Story, and allocated a portion of the book proceeds to the victims' families. While most families supported Lionel and Sherry, 3 families later filed lawsuits against Lionel. 2 for using their names in the book without consent, and a third, the family of Stephen Hicks, filing a wrongful death suit, citing parental negligence. Joyce Flint passed away from cancer on November 27, 2000. Prior to her demise, she had made at least one suicide attempt. Dahmer's younger brother, David, opted to change his surname and currently lives in seclusion.